And away we go. We're moving. They were the machines that made Britain great. Fast, revolutionary, and sometimes downright dangerous. These are the stories of our engineering masterpieces that shook the world and drive the way we live today. Of all the great British machines, one type of machine more than any other transformed life in both Britain and across the world.
In 1800, Britain was booming thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Towns and cities were expanding, factories were springing up, and the population was growing fast.
But travel had remained unchanged for thousands of years, by foot, by boat, or by horse and carriage.
Then, in the space of just 30 years, a series of brilliant British pioneers started a transport revolution. They created extraordinary new machines, built roads made of iron, and changed the world forever.
This is the era in which the train was born.
Iron Bridge Gorge, Shropshire. At the dawn of the 19th century.
This amazing contraption was the world's first railway locomotive. In 1802, here in Coalbrookdale, powered by spluttering steam and coal, it hauled itself along iron rails and transformed the world.
But the story of the railways begins much earlier, and it begins underground. Down here in dark, wet mines.
Mining in Britain was big business. Whether it was producing lead from this mine in the North Pennines, tin from Cornwall, or coal from countless mines across the country. And back in about 1600, British miners reinvented an idea that had been around since Roman times.
They realized that the easiest way to get precious coal or minerals out of mines was to put a cart on rails.
Originally made of wood, these rail systems were called tramways, and these ones date back to the early part of the 19th century. Let's give it a try, shall we?
Well, a drop of oil might help, but it's much easier than carrying by hand. By 1800, most mines had a whole network of tramways. But of course, there was another key ingredient for a railway: the locomotive.
Well, that story also begins down here with the solution to a very different problem.
Water.
Flooding was a big problem for miners. As miners dug deeper, they inevitably hit water as the water table was reached. In the tin mines of Cornwall, the seams stretched out below the seabed. If these deposits were to be mined, the water would have to be pumped.
For years, this was done with water wheels, but they needed a river to power them. In the early 18th century, a newfangled machine started taking their place: the steam-driven engine. The earliest, Thomas Newcomen's atmospheric engines, used steam cooled in a cylinder to drive pumping gear. The first was built in 1712, and by 1800, 2,000 were in use across Europe. They allowed miners to dig deeper than ever before, but there was room for improvement. I've come to Kew Bridge Steam Museum in London to fire up an example of one of the most important British machines of all time. This type of engine powered Britain for over 100 years and provided the starting point for the development of railway locomotives.
And here it is, the James Watt steam engine.
James Watt, an instrument maker from Glasgow, developed his first steam engine in 1763 after repairing a Newcomen pump. This engine was built in 1820, not to pump out mines, but to pump drinking water to West London. It's a long way from this to an engine that can sit in a locomotive, but without it, we'd never have got there. And now we're almost ready to fire her up.
At the moment, it's kind of like a sort of slumbering giant.
Very much so.
That kind of still wants to stay asleep, but we're waking it up into the day.
James Watt's engines were the first to use steam pressure to push a piston. Inside this 1,088-gallon cylinder, steam pushes down a piston that fits snugly inside. Up here, a giant pivot uses each downward piston stroke to lift up a rod on the other side, which is connected to the pumping gear. Once the pump is raised, gravity is allowed to pull it back down, which injects the water inside it into the required pipes below, and at the same time raises the steam piston at the far end. There's a pause as the steam pressure builds up, then the cycle begins again. And the great thing about this engine is that once it's running, it drives itself.
Well, the engine is now running automatically. All the driver has to do is start it and stop it and regulate it. Okay. The engine looks after itself.
It's just a joy to watch all the wonderfully crafted valves, rods and levers running almost silently. It's brilliantly thought out 19th century automation. But there's one thing you might just have noticed about this engine. It's huge.
That's because James Watt believed the only way to power his engine was with low-pressure steam.
His steam was generated by massive kettle-like boilers such as this one, made of a patchwork of iron riveted together then bricked over.
The boilers provided steam at around 2 to 3 pounds per square inch, which is about 7 times less than a typical central heating boiler. With the materials and metalwork available at the time, Watt considered the use of high-pressure steam to be extremely dangerous.
So instead of increasing steam pressure to produce more power, Watt and his business partner Matthew Boulton built bigger and bigger engines with more low-pressure boilers. And why not? They worked brilliantly. They were used in mines and factories across the country, filling canals, hammering metal, grinding grain, minting coins, and spinning thread. These great British machines drove the Industrial Revolution and would go on to power the world.
But Watt's dogged insistence on low pressure meant that his engines were far too big and heavy to pull themselves along, never mind power a train. So instead, the breakthrough that would lead to the locomotive came from a far more daring, maverick engineer, a man James Watt despised, but who was affectionately known to his friends as Captain Dick.
Captain Dick was, of course, Richard Trevithick. He was a giant of a man, 6'2", and known for his extraordinary strength. A man who achieved the impossible by refusing to listen to reason. He ignored the advice, the wisdom, even the legal writs from James Watt in pursuit of high-pressure steam. With limited coal reserves in his native Cornwall, Trevithick started out trying to make engines that were more efficient than Watt's. His first great innovation was to replace Watt's kettle-shaped boilers with cylindrical ones, a shape that spread the steam pressure evenly and so was much stronger. Of course, Trevithick's high-pressure engines did infringe a few of Watt's patents. But did he care?
One bailiff who made it to Cornwall armed with an injunction from Watt was bound with rope and suspended over a mine shaft. He didn't bother Trevithick again.
Trevithick soon realised that he could make small, powerful engines, and he knocked together a prototype to demonstrate their wider potential. The world's first self-propelled passenger vehicle, the Puffing Devil, trundled triumphantly down a Cornish lane in December 1801. Some say it came to a sticky end, that during some slightly premature celebrations in the local tavern, the boiler exploded. Perhaps he shouldn't have had that extra pint. Richard Trevithick was not a man to be put off by the odd unexpected explosion, which was good because his second steam-powered road vehicle really paved the way for the first railway locomotive. In the early 1800s, London was the busiest city in Europe, with a population of over 1 million. Most travelled around the city by foot, the more wealthy in horse-drawn carriages. Captain Dick had a bold plan to revolutionise transport in the capital, with his next brilliant invention, a self-propelled bus.
Here is the first ever London bus, the London Steam Carriage. And like Trevithick himself, it's a bit of a beast.
This lovingly crafted, though bizarre-looking contraption is a replica of Trevithick's original machine.
Look at these massive 8-foot wheels. Trevithick believed the roads in London to be in a shocking state. By using larger wheels, he hoped to provide a comfier ride. The heart of any machine, of course, is the engine and boiler. And look at this, absolutely tiny compared to the Bolton and Watt Leviathans.
That's thanks to high-pressure steam. And once the pressure's up, we'll take her for a spin around Regent's Park, part of her original route. In 1802, Trevithick's steam carriage had a series of trials across London, including a run along Oxford Street. This machine was so outlandish that shops were closed and the street was cleared of horses and carriages as the crowds came out to watch the spectacle. And now it's my turn to create a bit of a spectacle.
Please tell me, how do I drive this machine?
The steering is just by tiller here.
Yeah? And what about a brake?
Oh, don't worry about that.
Of all the things I've driven in my life, this is the one I've secretly got the most fear about, because I just do not know what is going to happen when I get aboard this thing and open up the regulator. But we're going to find out now. Right, we have our throttle here, our tiller here, no mirrors, and we're off.
There you go, that's it.
God save us.
Right.
We're moving. We're going. Incredible. Just incredible. Oh, this is amazing. It is unlike anything that I've ever driven. You know, for 1802, it's just extraordinary.
Trevithick's steam bus could carry up to 8 people and was capable of up to 8 miles an hour. All made possible by his brilliant engine design. The firebox is built inside the cylindrical boiler. 2 flues run out of the front of the firebox back through the boiler to the chimney, so he's maximised the hot surface area that's turning water into high-pressure steam. At £30 per square inch, it uses 10 times higher pressure than that Watt pumping engine. Trevithick's single cylinder is also built into the boiler. Keeping it warm makes it more efficient. And it's double acting. Valves inject steam into one side of the piston and then the other, so both strokes are power strokes. Those power strokes are converted into rotation using a forked piston rod attached to the crankshaft. And the drive is transmitted through gears to each rear wheel. All in, the engine weighs just 300 kilograms and produces 3 horsepower. That power-to-weight ratio is the key. It's a superb, compact and very efficient design. But what on earth did the public make of it in 1802?
I've got Trevithick expert Phil Hoskins in the back of my bus to tell me more.
This was so unlike anything that people had seen in a world of the horse and carriage. What did people think? How did they react?
They didn't know what they were looking at. They saw something arrive in front of them which didn't have horses. It was spitting fire and it was puffing and chuffing. Well, they're absolutely amazed.
Unfortunately, Trevithick's success was short-lived. On one run at the heady speed of 6 miles an hour, he took out a whole garden fence. It was carnage. But the steam carriage was revolutionary. The ability to power a vehicle with a high-pressure steam engine would soon change the world.
The steam engine on this carriage was the development of every steam engine as we know it today. Being cylindrical, it can hold high pressure. When you've got a boiler that will hold high pressure, you can do almost anything.
The world had never seen anything like this before. A passenger-carrying vehicle with no horse in sight. But Trevithick was ahead of his time. The London steam carriage was just too outlandish, too strange, too terrifying to be a success. Fortunately, nothing could stop Trevithick's belief in his inventions, and he had already set in motion construction of another even more important design. At Coalbrookdale in Shropshire, today a picture postcard scene. But at the turn of the 19th century, this place was a hive of industry, dirty, smelly and noisy. With coal and iron ore reserves and good transport links thanks to the River Severn, this was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. Home to the world's first iron bridge and another first.
You may think you know the first railway locomotive in history, but I bet you're not thinking of this one. This is a replica of a machine built by Trevithick, or at least to his design, in 1802. Very little is known about it, but it's thought to be a kind of prototype of his first working load-pulling locomotive.
This crazy collection of cogs and connecting rods is known as the Coalbrookdale locomotive. And although it looks a bit Heath Robinson, the experts here are in no doubt about its importance.
I mean, it's incredibly important. I mean, you think this thing was built, never mind Stephenson's rocket, this was built before Trafalgar. Yes, you know, yes. This is a high-pressure steam engine. You know, this is the thing that put the chuff in the Industrial Revolution. This is high-pressure steam at work. And you start to put it in context to the world events of the time. It's absolutely amazing. This is like landing on the moon.
I can't wait to have a go on it, with driver Cyril Connew. One small step for me, one giant chuff for mankind.
Oh, off we go. Look at that. Superb.
On the first steam train.
There you go, we're on the first steam train, yes.
In many ways, the design is very similar to the London steam carriage, with a single cylinder set inside a cylindrical boiler that operates at 45 pounds per square inch. A trombone-style arrangement of piston and connecting rods drives a big flywheel on one side and a gear wheel on the other. With about 7 horsepower, this machine could probably do about 5 miles an hour. But there are differences.
Part of the driving experience of this Coalbrookdale locomotive is the fact that you're on a machine that doesn't have any brakes, and you have to stop it with steam.
Yes, put it in reverse.
By changing the way the steam enters the cylinder, letting steam into the wrong end, the steam acts as a brake, slowing the piston down and bringing the engine to a stop.
Ah, there we go. So you're letting steam in the other side?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. I suppose it's a great pity you've got such a short stretch of track.
We're hoping later to get that bridge down behind us.
Yeah.
And then we can take the track right back.
That's the blast pipe we're hearing now, isn't it? Oh, hello.
Hold on, Cyril. We're not extending that line just yet.
That's me not taking notice.
Oh, you're right. Sorry, it's my fault, Cyril,
That's
for...
all right.
As I said, no brakes. It happens.
It's proved the point.
It has, yeah.
Of course, this machine does have one very big, very important difference to the London steam carriage. It runs on a track. And there was a very real concern whether rails, with their low friction, would provide enough traction for a steam-powered loco to work. You need friction for traction. And on a damp day like today, the 4.5-ton Colebrookdale locomotive barely has enough. We're actually getting wheel spin. The solution, as Trevithick must have realised, was that a practical load-pulling loco would need to be both more powerful and a lot heavier, which proved easier said than done. 2 years later, to win a wager between two South Wales ironworks owners, Trevithick unveiled his 7-ton, 17-horsepower Penny Darren, named after the location of the ironworks. And in February 1804, he successfully hauled 10 tons of iron down a 9-mile tramway. This loco's extra weight gave better traction, but it was so heavy, it soon broke the rails it ran on.
After a short time in service, the locomotive ran off the rails, was hauled back to Penny Darren by horses, and spent the rest of her days working as a stationary engine.
Close, but no cigar. Which unfortunately was becoming a way of life for Trevithick.
As you can see from his inventions, he was a brilliant pioneer, a masterful engineer, but ahead of his time, eventually dying in poverty while others continued the revolution inspired by his ideas.
Over the next 20 years, engineers across the country, inspired by Trevithick, tried their hand at building steam locomotives for their tramways. At one colliery, Killingworth in County Durham, the chief engineer built a series of machines that culminated in my next great British locomotive, Locomotion Number 1. The key to the success of this machine was that its designer, George Stephenson, was the man who finally tackled the problem of the rails.
The very earliest tramways were made of wood, but they'd wear out quickly due to the weight of wagons on them. The Penny Darren ran on iron rails, an improvement, but not perfect. Why? Because the rails were made out of cast iron.
Cast iron was made, as the name suggests, by pouring molten iron into a cast. But with a high carbon content, the finished product is very brittle, which means although it's strong under compression, it's very weak under tension. Great for bridge supports, but when a cast iron rail has to support a locomotive, this happens.
And that's pretty much what happened to the rails the Penny Darren ran on.
So Stephenson turned to another type of iron, one that was much less brittle thanks to a lower carbon content. Worked, or wrought iron. It had been used for centuries, worked by smithies to make everything from horseshoes to nails. But a new manufacturing process developed in the late 18th century made wrought iron much cheaper. Stephenson insisted on using wrought iron rails on the project that made him famous, the world's first public railway. He was hired by a wealthy merchant, Edward Pease, who in 1821 had persuaded Parliament to let him construct a 27-mile line linking collieries in the northeast and the town of Darlington to the River Tees at Stockton.
The line was originally going to be a horse-drawn tramway, but Stephenson persuaded Pease to let him resurvey the route, operate at least part of it with steam locomotives, and even to carry passengers.
The line took 4 years to build, with 48-foot-high embankments, stationary engines to help trains up the steeper inclines, and a stone railway bridge spanning the River Skerne. Meanwhile, Stephenson and his son Robert set up a new company to build a new locomotive in time for the opening of the line.
The Manchester Guardian made the opening announcement. A superior locomotive engine of the most improved construction will be employed with a train of convenient carriages for the conveyance of proprietors and strangers. Strangers indeed. And here is that superior locomotive engine, Locomotion Number 1. George Stephenson's finest locomotive to date and the first locomotive in the world to operate a passenger service.
On the 25th of September 1825, Stephenson's locomotion was ready for its first big test. The grand opening of the Stockton to Darlington railway line.
Over 450 people climbed on board. Most were carried by coal wagons. But for dignitaries, Stephenson built this, the world's first passenger carriage. What actually looks like a mobile garden shed. Stephenson called it the Experiment. It seated 18, but with no suspension, it must have been an uncomfortable ride. Hooked up behind locomotion, they set off at a breathtaking 12 miles an hour.
Over 40,000 19th century train spotters witnessed the world's first passenger steam train leave the station.
But it must have been intimate with 17 other people in there, that's for sure. Kind of place you want to be alone with the Pussycat Dolls.
This engine is an extremely innovative evolution of Trevithick's first high-pressure locos. Instead of one, there are two cylinders, positioned vertically inside the boiler. Using two cylinders increases the power of the engine, and they're designed to operate out of phase. One is always half a stroke behind the other. This prevents the locomotive stopping with both pistons at the top of their stroke, which would make starting up again very difficult. It also does away with the need for a flywheel. The other big step forward is that Trevithick's gear wheels are gone. This was the first locomotive to use coupling rods to transfer power to the wheels. All four of them.
What I'm noticing up here is virtually everything is moving.
Yeah.
So it must have been quite a life for the driver, really, making sure that he didn't
Exactly, yeah.
Get moved by anything or sort of get hit by anything, really.
Although she took some passengers, locomotion was built primarily to haul coal, and in that she was a success. She was a loco for hire on a line that anyone could use for a fee, a business model based on the canals. Mine owners paid by the ton, and 10,000 tons of coal were transported in the first 3 months alone.
But the line had teething problems. To begin with, it wasn't a dedicated steam line, so the steam locos were constantly being held up by slower-moving horse-drawn wagons.
There was no real timetable, and crucially, it was just a single line, with occasional sidings and passing places. It was chaos. Locomotion would frequently come face to face with other wagons. With rival companies refusing to back up into sidings, bitter feuds and even fights frequently broke out.
Hey, you! Back up, damn you! I need to be instructed by the NEAT!
All right, keep your hair on.
Thank you!
The railway and Stephenson's locomotion were great engineering triumphs of the day. But ultimately, the Stockton to Darlington was a glorified tramway. The first real railway was yet to come. And that railway would be built between the most industrially advanced city in the world and one of Britain's greatest ports. Manchester, with its 30,000 steam looms, was the cotton capital of the world. Liverpool traded raw cotton from America and sent finished fabric around the globe.
This would be the first fully steam-driven line, with double tracks, stations, freight, fast passenger trains, and even a timetable. Not a machine as such, but certainly a great feat of British engineering. And who else to build it but George Stephenson?
Transport between the two cities had always been important. 100 years earlier, 70 pack horses a day left Liverpool for Manchester. Once the roads improved, the first stagecoach ran in 1760, and the building of canals saw the city's growth rocket. But the canals were big business. Canal owners had a monopoly on trade and could almost charge what they wanted. They weren't going to let the rail line be built without a fight.
Stephenson's original planned route ran through land belonging to three powerful canal owners, Lords Sefton, Derby and Bradshaw.
They made Stephenson's job of surveying the line impossible, blockading their land and even firing live rounds. By the time Stephenson's route was presented to Parliament, there was plenty of anti-railway propaganda. First, they were dangerous. It wasn't unheard of for boilers to explode. But the railways, they said, would also be the death of stagecoach hands. Horses would starve, cows would stop grazing, hens stop laying, and pregnant women would miscarry. Getting the bill through was going to be a challenge.
It didn't help that the survey was a bit of a mess. The height of the route passing over the River Irwell was found to be below the flood level of the river. Not a good start. The bill was thrown out.
So a new surveyor was hired, one with a bit more political nous, Charles Vignol.
Vignol rerouted the railway, bypassing some of the greatest objectors and canal owners, and bought off the rest.
In 1826, the bill was passed, and Stephenson was rehired to take on the immense engineering challenges of building the line. Crossing a deep valley required the building of the 9-arch Sankey Viaduct. At Olive Mount, people said the deep 2-mile cutting looked like it had been dug by giants. On the approach to Liverpool, a tunnel over a mile long had to be constructed under the city. The excavation cost many lives. Once finished, it became a tourist attraction before the line went into service. But Stephenson's greatest challenge was Chat Moss, a wide stretch of bogland on the outskirts of Manchester.
Chat Moss could easily swallow a horse and cart. Stephenson had to figure out how to build a railway across it. I wouldn't drive a locomotive across that.
After some failed attempts, he got some help from the locals with some tried and trusted low-tech engineering. First, he created drainage pipes from old barrels, which he sank either side of the line. Then he laid woven wooden mats on the marsh, with brushwood and gravel on top. The weight squeezed water from the moss into the drains. Eventually, the land was so solid, rails could be laid. In 1830, the line was finally complete. Over 30 miles of double track had been laid on stone sets or wooden sleepers. It was an engineering masterpiece, and of course required the best locomotives in the land. So engineers the length and breadth of the country had been busy building locos for the most famous locomotive competition of all time, the legendary Rainhill Trials. The winner would take a £500 prize and a contract to build locomotives for the new railway line. There were some bizarre entries. One, the Cyclopede, wasn't even a steam engine. It was a treadmill on wheels powered by a horse. But there were several serious contenders. Sans Pareil, a great big boiler on wheels, was built by the locomotive superintendent at the Stockton and Darlington Railway, Timothy Hackworth. The lightweight Novelty, designed for speed, was built by John Braithwaite and John Ericsson, who had been building steam-powered fire engines at their works in London. They were up against a third engine, built in secret at the Stephenson workshop.
George Stephenson was busy engineering the line, so gave his son the task of developing an engine to enter the competition. Robert built a machine specifically designed to win the Rainhill Trials. With a radically innovative high-pressure boiler, it was the Rocket.
Possibly the most famous steam loco of them all, and what a beauty. After a year of painstaking engineering work, this replica has just been completed. Yes. And today, for the first time, she's going to be put through her paces.
In October 1829, the Rainhill Trials took place. race on a recently completed 1.5 mile stretch of the Manchester-Liverpool line. And 15,000 people came out to watch.
During the 9 days of the trials, each loco was required to pull loaded wagons equivalent to 3 times its own weight on a series of 20 runs, equivalent to travelling from Liverpool to Manchester and back. The judges would measure average speed and fuel and water consumption. With some great engineering innovations, Stephenson had made sure the rocket was up to the challenge. A key design feature was a new boiler capable of producing steam pressure at 50 pounds per square inch. Inside the boiler, instead of the normal 1 or 2 large flues, Robert Stephenson had fitted 25 copper tubes, connecting the firebox to the chimney at the front, massively increasing the surface area to heat the water. He also brought the cylinders outside the boiler and set them at an angle, simplifying the connections to the drive wheels and creating a smoother ride. But how would the rocket do against the surprisingly stiff competition?
Novelty was stunningly quick, hitting 20 miles an hour with ease, and later managing 30 miles an hour with passengers.
She quickly became the crowd's favourite. But soon things started to go wrong.
But having been built in just 7 weeks, she hadn't been thoroughly tested and therefore wasn't race ready.
Early on, the bellows blew. They were repaired, but then on the final day of the trials, the water feed to the boiler burst. So Novelty never completed the 70 miles.
And to make things worse, each time Novelty broke down, Rocket was sent out to entertain the crowds.
Running back and forth along the track, it hauled passengers or loaded wagons with ease. The judges were impressed.
Hackworth's Sans-Pareil also had teething troubles. He'd built the loco in his spare time, outsourcing key components, and had finished her just before the trials started without any proper testing. Getting Sans-Pareil ready for her first run, Hackworth discovered her boiler was leaking.
That called for serious repairs, but the judges allowed him the time. Again, Rocket was wheeled out to entertain the crowds. Once the leak was fixed, Sans-Pareil managed her first official run. Although her fuel consumption was high, she managed to hit 16 miles an hour with a full load.
She was looking good, but then... disaster. She came to a sudden halt in a cloud of steam and smoke. Her feed pump that pumps water into her boiler had packed in, and a fail-safe device had let water into her flue pipes. The damage was devastating. She would take days to repair. Her trial was over.
So far, no loco had proved capable of simulating a complete return run on the new line. On the 4th day of the trials, at her first attempt, Rocket completed the 70 miles pulling a load of 13 tons, 3 times her own weight. So, as befitting the first intercity express locomotive, we're now going to open her up and see what we can do. Miles an hour. She completed the runs in just over 6 hours. An average of about 12 miles an hour, but recording a top speed of 24. Rocket had done everything asked of her. Just as importantly, the track had survived the ordeal. Must have been absolutely terrifying to be on an untested, untried experiment, really. In a final display of showmanship, Stephenson unhitched the wagons and sent Rocket off for a high-speed run and achieved 35 miles an hour. The public and press were ecstatic. For the first time, humans had travelled at a higher sustained speed than was possible on horseback. The Rocket had won and secured its place in history. With her radical new boiler and firebox and improved pistons and connecting rods, this was the start of a new generation of steam locomotives. And riding this wonderful replica today, I can see why this truly great British machine swept aside all the competition. Fabulous. But there was a tragic twist in the tale. On the 15th of September 1830, Rocket was one of 8 locomotives lined up for the grand opening procession. The route was packed with spectators to see the first trains run from Liverpool to Manchester. The guest of honour was the Duke of Wellington in his own specially constructed luxury carriage. At 10:40, the Duke's train, the Northumbrian, left Liverpool and 17 miles later stopped to take on water.
The passengers got out to stretch their legs, and then there was a cry. Rocket, pulling another train on the second line, was bearing down on them fast. Well, at about 15 miles an hour.
Men scrambled back on board. Then there was a shout.
Huskisson, for God's sake, man, get to your place!
But the Right Honourable Member for Liverpool, William Huskisson, wasn't quick enough. His leg was crushed under the train's wheel.
Huskisson was bundled onto the Northumbrian and rushed to Manchester at speeds of up to 40 miles per hour, but to no avail. He died that night. A sad footnote to the great locomotive that won the Rainhill trials and cemented Stephenson's place in history as the father of the railways.
Rocket was a turning point. Thanks to its winning design, it paved the way for a transport revolution. It was followed by another great piece of British engineering that finally realised the steam locomotive as a fully matured machine.
The Planet, completed in December 1830, this triumph of engineering made the final steps from the rocket prototype to the finished article and created a kind of blueprint for every steam locomotive for the next 100 years.
With Robert Stephenson's Planet and the new Liverpool and Manchester line, Britain had a scheduled passenger railway experience that we would recognise today. Passengers could come here to the Liverpool Road Station, the original terminal of the 1830 railway line, and catch a timetabled service to Liverpool. First-class passengers sat in covered carriages, second class weren't so lucky, with open carriages that took the brunt of the smoke and steam.
A stagecoach delivered passengers to the station where they would purchase their ticket. Departure was signalled by a bugle. They hadn't quite worked out how to do railway stations, though. For a start, there was no platform, so the passengers had to climb up into the carriage, like this.
But once on board, passengers could look forward to a journey time of just an hour and a half to cover the 30 miles.
Great exercise, though.
Liverpool, here we come. Oi, how come he gets on the footplate? Planet went into service within a year of Rocket being built, but she feels like an engine from another era. The biggest difference is that the pistons have moved again. They now sit horizontally, low down between the wheels under the front of the boiler. This gives the engine a much smoother ride, increasingly important as faster and faster speeds are achieved. And the multi-tube boiler of Rocket has been further improved with this dome. A dome allows steam to be collected high above the water level in the boiler, preventing any water getting into the cylinders. This engine is another beautiful replica, but it's clear that these and many other small details made the Planet a far superior loco. Very reliable, very smooth, and capable of 40 miles an hour.
I need to knock off the regulator now a little bit.
Well, we're all right till we get to the bridge.
Right.
Because you can see our stopping point is the 2 circles on the gate.
I see.
If we go any farther, we'll be on the main line.
Okay. We don't want that, do we?
No.
all of a sudden, I feel I'm on a proper steam train. This is no prototype, no work in progress, but the real deal. And it's wonderful. But that main line is approaching fast.
And we have
Come the day, where's the brakes?
That's the brake.
Okay. So if I pull that slightly, yeah?
Very, very slowly.
And then regulator back open and back we go.
Yes. Quick. 2
Wow, how exciting, I'm driving planet. A great thrill, it really is, and a lot smoother and a lot quieter and more civilized than, to be honest, I thought it would be.
In its first full year, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway Company carried almost 500,000 passengers, with first class paying 5 shillings, second class 3 shillings and sixpence, and a pig, should it wish to travel, 1 shilling and sixpence. In 1831, its profits were in excess of £70,000, the equivalent of 5.4 million today. Railways were now officially big business. New lines would quickly follow, in Britain and then the world, carrying hundreds and then thousands of bigger and bigger trains, at speeds that would one day top 200 miles an hour.
The planet had led the way into the future. The railway era had begun, and it would make the world a very different place.